Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this episode of Beyond Clean, we've got a special release recording from the 2025 HSPA event in Louisville, Kentucky, as our team was broadcasting from a live podcast studio in the Sterile Healthcare booth. Stay tuned for some one-of-a-kind interviews and clinical insight from many of the top names in the SPD industry. And now, on to the show.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name's Hank Balch with the Beyond Clean team. We are broadcasting live here in Louisville, Kentucky, HSPA 2025 here in the Sterile Healthcare booth 101. And we're wrapping up our final podcast series in a 4-part series that we've done this week. This episode is called Nonstop Compliance, staying ahead of industry standards and best practices. And I've got a great group of panelists. They're going to be talking with us today. We'll start here with a quick introduction. Jill Holdsworth is an IP manager at Emory University Medical Center, Midtown, down there in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, are you actually in Atlanta or are you outside?
The hospital is actually right in the center of the city, but I do not live in the city. I am a suburb girl.
Great. Well, we'll learn a little bit more about Jill in just a moment. But then to her left is Richard Bancroft, Senior Director of Scientific here at Sterile. Richard, welcome to the panel with us today.
Thank you.
Maybe, Richard, let's start with you. What's a little bit of your background? You're not a new face in the industry. I've seen you out there speaking and publishing many times in the space. But for anyone who's not familiar with the way that you contribute specifically to the sterile processing space, give us a little bit of background.
Okay, so I've been with Steris for nearly 39 years, so I'm a little bit long in the tooth. I like to call myself a bit of a dinosaur, but in a good way. I have a team of scientists that report into me. I'm a scientist as well in research and development. But the other half of my role, if you like, is coordinating our standards activities. So Steris is a big advocate of putting our best foot forward in working with development of standards and best practices. So I coordinate that for the organization.
Great. Well, we are going to be talking about industry standards, so that's probably why we picked you on this panel discussion today. Got the right guy. So, Jill, what about you? You're out there speaking, educating, not only within the sterile processing space, but you've got a big presence in the infection prevention space as well. But for anyone who's brand new to Jill Holdsworth, what's your story?
Well, I've been in IP for about 15 plus years now, which makes me feel like a dinosaur in my own right.
I don't know. You got a while to catch up with Richard here.
I'm working on it. My background is actually I'm an exercise physiologist, and I got into IP in kind of a non-traditional way, which is great. I fell in love with sterile processing quickly into my IP career. I got my CRCST about 8 years ago, and I got my CHL last year. And I love the sterile processing space. I've been involved in HSPA for a lot of years as well. And I love working with the people there and in this organization. So I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, good to have you. And let's jump in to the topic at hand today, which is standards in the sterile processing space. Maybe let's start with definitions, Richard. When we say standard, What does that mean? What can it mean? Are there different definitions that we need to have rolling around in our head?
Okay, well, I'll try and not to anesthetize the audience by going into too much tedium. A lot of people, first off, look at standards as that must be pretty boring work. The reality is yes, there's a little bit of that, but the majority of what we do is actually really exciting. It's like having a really good intellectual argument with your best friends, but on a bigger scale. I mean, that's probably the best way I would describe that. But standards are written by a group of technical experts. And those technical experts are, the likes of all of us. So you don't need to be some kind of elite person. We want people with their feet on the ground that know what they're doing. And we write standards in a manner that we describe either as best practice or consensus. So by best practice, we mean that we're trying to draft requirements that will be what we consider to be the best way of doing what we do, with an eye, of course, on patient safety. That's always the sort of underpinning of everything that we do. And then with regard to consensus, that doesn't mean unanimous agreement by everyone in the room. We try, and we don't always get that, but we try to get agreement. But if you've got one or two people that don't agree, then that's life. We move on. But what we've got is a significant majority, for want of a better term, to reach that consensus.
So just a quick follow-up to that, Richard. So are these standards, we got publicized standards that come out in kind of book form or on a website? Are there any other places where standards are kind of pushed, or is that majority, again, like we use the phrase standards, are we referring to published document that's either coming out of the consensus agreements or those best practices that you talked about?
Okay, so most standards that are available to us come from likes of AAMI, AAMI, who I'm sure most of you know. I mean, I've only got to mention ST79 and most people's ears prick up, I would hope anyway. So those standards are published by AAMI. They are copyrighted documents, so they have to be purchased, but they're relatively good value for money, I would argue, because when you consider how much time and effort, I mean, it's literally years of effort that goes into each new revision of those documents. What you're buying is actually really good value. And I'm not trying to sell standards because I get no revenue from that. But I'm just trying to emphasize that there has to be a cost associated with them to allow the infrastructure for us to develop those standards. But standards can exist either as like a guidance document, which typically don't have requirements, or it can exist as a standard, and those standards do have requirements. So they use the word shall throughout the document. So if you want to claim conformity to the standard, and I must emphasize, standards are not compulsory, you don't have to follow them, but they're best practice. And I think that professionally, we all understand that we have to follow best practice. So it's a trodden path that we need to really follow standards, even though legally that doesn't exist.
Yeah, we may get into more of that question too. That's one of the hot topics again is, how much of this must I follow? Shall I follow? Should I follow? But hopefully we'll have some time to come back to that. So Jill, obviously from the user or the implementation side as an IMP, you're often supporting your sterile processing departments and taking these standards and then applying them to real life. What is that dynamic like in taking new standards in particular, and then changing the workflow perhaps, or how we're doing testing or how we're gathering data? Obviously, that's the world that many of our sterile processing listeners are living in. There's constant updates coming to different standards, maybe not the same standard document, but there's a new one now that we have to implement. What's your role been as an IP support person in seeing these standards come off the page and into real department life?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because a lot of people don't know how to implement these standards when they first come out. Let's talk about ST108. That's a great one. We can talk about the EVS standard that came out as an amendment to ST79. That's one of my favorite ones. And how can an IP help all of you that are trying to implement these standards? As an IP, I'm usually the first one that reads these and say, let's work on this together. How can we do this together? That's not always the case, but I will tell you as an IP, we're the ones that are going to get cited if you're not doing these. If you're Joint Commission certified, it's the IC standards that this is going to get cited under. So your IP does deeply care about these standards that are written. Joint Commission surveyors do know that these are consensus standards, but they also want to know, what are you following? What do your policies say? Some of them will come in and say, have you read the new amendments to ST 79? Have you read ST 108? Are you following it? What does your policy say? And if your policy says we're following ST 108, then you have to. So be careful. Number one, be careful what you put in your policy. But if you tell a surveyor we're following ST 108, you have to. If you tell a surveyor we've done a gap analysis, we've done a risk assessment, and here's our plan, that's going to be really impressive. And so that's where you need to work with your IP on implementing these new standards. And I get it. It's really hard. But again, as an IP, these become my problem if we're cited, because it's all under the IC standards. And they were updated about a year ago to where the sterilization, HLD, all of that became more rigorous. So if you haven't read the updated standards, you need to, and you need to be working even closer with your IP, because all of the action plans after Joint Commission or DNV surveys, they all fall under the IP, and they can help you implement all of these standards. So when new things come out, which ST 108 is probably the best example, the IP can help be one of your biggest supporters, biggest team members. In some of our facilities, we're leading these efforts. So really get with your IP if you aren't already, and have them help you.
So Jill, a quick follow-up. In Richard's description of how these standards are created, years, like multiple years of work, study, research, consensus being gathered together to publish the document. And then obviously there's the rollout stage into the industry. And the question is always, well, there's the new standard. How long do I have to try to fix this process until the expectation is it's actually going to happen? Is it going to take us 5 years to implement, just like it took it 5 years to create the standard? What's the pulse that you're getting from some of the surveyors or conversations out there today?
Yeah, it's interesting. Different surveyors are taking that differently. So I did have a surveyor come in right after those new amendments to SD 79 came out, and they wanted to know that we were talking about it, that we were making plans. They obviously didn't think we'd already put it into place because it'd been less than a month. So they're lenient on that respect, because they know it can't happen like that. You're not going to snap your fingers and have changes. But if it's been 2 years and you haven't even read it yet, then they may want to know that you are aware of standards. They're not going to be as lenient at that point. But that's where I say risk assessments, gap analysis, having an action plan, showing them that you're following best practices. That's really what they want to see. And again, if it's in your policy that you're 100% following something like ST 108, then they may not be as forgiving, because your policy already says that you're following it. So that's where you have to be careful when you're adding things to policies. But if you're saying that we've read ST 108, we've done the gap analysis, and here's the progress we've made, that's going to be super impressive to them.
So let's switch gears here a little bit, Richard. I want to come back, obviously. The overarching conversation today is about standards, but beyond the documents themselves and the awareness maybe that leaders will have, educators will have, there's an integration aspect of this, of how do we get the changes and the expectations of the standards into the hands and feet of our technician, into the actual processes that we see in our departments. And many times that comes through competencies and how we manage competencies, how we utilize technology to help us hardwire some of these changes to the standards in the workflow. What have you seen work well? Or what advice would you give to department leaders who are trying to move toward best practices, but then view there's a gap in their technology or there's a gap in their competencies? So where would you tell them to start?
Well, The first thing I would say is sort of echoing what Jill just mentioned a moment ago. Make sure everything is documented, because if you are documenting your journey, then when you have an audit, you can refer an auditor to, this is what I'm doing. And as long as that reflects reality, I don't think anybody is going to be too firm on you for that, because there are some practical issues with conformity sometimes, maybe new equipment, maybe workflow changes, which are not easy to implement. So one of my responses to your question is, that make sure that you're completely transparent in writing, so that you can point an auditor to, this is my plan, this is what I'm doing. But from a standards perspective, when we draft standards, we value people who are feet on the ground people inputting, because we don't want to write a utopian standard that nobody can comply to. That's not practical either. We need to write a standard that delivers what we need for patient safety, but also does it in the most expedient manner, the easiest manner. We're not looking to make people's lives complicated. If we put a requirement into a standard, that requirement is there for good reason. It's not because we're a bunch of obtuse people sitting in a room trying to make people's lives difficult. We're doing that because we think it's best practice. And we recognize there's a journey from where you may be now to where we're going. SD79, as you may have heard earlier this week, is going to be at some point open for revision. Now, I always sigh a little bit because I know how much work that's going to be to do that, but it's also recognizing that whatever you're doing today will have to change to reflect what the new requirements are in that standard. And so it's a balance between stability and progress. Do we want to add new things into the standard to make the standard best practice and continue to be best practice, but are we doing it just to make sure that everybody is having to keep on their toes and keep adjusting and keep modifying everything? And so stability is a good thing. So I personally would not promote changes to a requirement unless there's a good reason for those changes. If the requirement is clear and it's perfectly safe and it's still best practice, let's leave that alone. Let's not touch that.
Right. And what we see many times is the best practice is actually creeping ahead of the current standard. And obviously that's what's moving that consensus to update the standard, because we're looking out and saying, hey, we do have more data. Now we have new workflows and we're seeing a safer outcome and a more consistent workflow. And now we do need to come together and then kind of codify these changes in the standards. But Richard, I want to come back to you real quick for a follow-up. The balance of technology in this as to what the standard says today and then what the standard is going to say tomorrow. Anytime you can't necessarily change your technology until the standard is updated, because otherwise there's no requirement or even recommendations to do it a new way. So how do you approach that balance of, when do we provide the technological solution for what's coming in an industry that's still operating in the old standard?
Okay, so you're right, it's a balance. But when we write standards, we try to write the requirements about what needs to happen without being too specific about how it needs to happen. So what I mean by that is we don't want to write a standard that is design specific. We wouldn't say it's got to be a sterilizer that's that size or a washer disinfector that's bright green, for example. I'm being silly with examples, but you just need to say it's an appropriate washer disinfector or it's an appropriate sterilizer at sufficient capacity. So if we're very careful about writing those requirements in that non-design specific way, it means that when new technology comes in, it may be a different looking sterilizer or washer disinfector or whole new equipment being brought into the department. But as long as the requirements were written about what needs to happen at the core level, then the standards are future-proofed for that change in technology.
Right. Yeah, that's a very innovative approach. You got a comment?
And I think this is also where we can also do a shameless plug for people to get involved in the standards groups. A lot of people have no idea what goes into writing these standards and development of these standards and how long it takes to update these standards. We were just having a conversation about this morning because it takes a lot of work and a lot of time to update these standards. So there is a lot of research, a lot of advancements going on where we could constantly be updating these standards, but it doesn't take just like a couple weeks to do that. These standards take a lot of work. So yes, we could update these standards all the time, but it just doesn't happen that easily.
So Jill, what's your advice for users? Like, as long as I've been in the industry since 2009, there's been a call for more users get involved in creating the standards, come to the meetings, contribute. Is the best way just to come to kind of view and learn and hear? Are there other ways to get prepared to add real value to those meetings too? Like, it's one thing to come and listen, but what we really need is we need you to come and listen and then contribute in order to add that voice of consensus. What more can people do? Or what advice would you give folks who are like, you know what, I should probably be a part of that?
Well, I will say how I got involved years ago. One of my colleagues said, why don't you just come with me and listen? Just experience what an AMI meeting is like. I went in person. I had no idea what the meeting was about. I wasn't involved in sterile processing at all at that point, and I had no idea why he wanted me to come with him. And I loved it. It was so far out of my comfort zone. It was the Protective Barriers Committee. I ended up being the chairman for 6 years after that.
They got you. They're like,
it really pulled me in. We updated the standard document that came out a couple years ago as an update, but it is really such a fascinating process. You really understand so much more once you get involved, and it's a rewarding experience. But just by going and watching and being involved, it really hooked me in. And if I may, I'd like Richard to just kind of give a little summary of how people can sign up and get involved, because I heard him do it this morning.
That's great. Yeah. So what is the process for folks who want to get plugged in?
So typically what we're talking about is participation with development of AMI standards, at least in this context here. So basically, whether you're a regulator like the FDA, whether you are a manufacturer, or whether you are an end user, infection preventionist, whatever you are, there's a place for you here. There are different mechanisms. Commercial people have to pay money, whereas people who are typically working in a hospital may not be. It depends on the circumstance. But on AMI's website, there is one of the headings is standards, and if you click on that, you can see all of the groups that AMI has, and I think there's something like 250 groups as well. It's enormous, so you really need to be focused on what do I want to get involved in, and then once you've decided I want to get involved, as long as you have permission from your organization to participate, because you're doing it really on behalf of that organization more than necessarily just as an individual, then you can just contact AMI. I'm not promoting them in any way, shape or form, but standards@ami.org, send an email to them and they'd be very happy to talk you through how you can participate. But if I can just add a little footnote to that as well, because standards are not just written at AMI level, standards are written at international level as well. And a lot of what I do is not just the AMI stuff, but also the international stuff, the European standards development as well. And these all have a common theme. They're all very similar, but the actual specific processes are all quite different. But one of the things that AMI does is serves as the US experts that input into that international work. So as well as developing standards like SD79, which is a homegrown national standard for the US, we can also, through AMI, participate in international work so that you can actually be a representative of the US and travel internationally and fight with the Germans, the French, the Brits, all of us together. Again, in this fun consensus intellectual manner that we like to talk about.
Comment, if you will, because you brought up the global standards, international standards. At times we have conflicting standards. Even in the U.S., we have different groups who have standards that are not quite aligning. Sometimes it's not, polar opposites, but there's some friction if you're looking at them both and saying, well, I can't actually do both of these. So I'm going to have to pick one or the other. Like you said, you've got to put it in your policy, which one of these you're following. What's your perspective that you would give to clinicians, because you've been on the inside of the creation of these and the consensus? How should clinicians view conflicting standards, or at least standards that look like they don't quite line up? Who's right? Is it a right or wrong? Is it just a navigation? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you raise a good point, Hank, and I think that the way I would respond is that we need to be collaborative. So generating standards shouldn't be a competition. And so if there are two standards developing organizations developing standards that are in danger of overlapping, there's got to be a level of coordination, because that's not helpful to anyone. How can you have best practice here and best practice here that are different? We need to be aligned. And so there is this unwritten rule in standards development and the organizations that develop standards that you work in your own wheelhouse and you don't sort of encroach into somebody else's area. So what's helpful to do within a standard is say, for further information, see X, and X is somebody else's standard, without trying to incorporate or reword and possibly cause problems there. But the other aspect I would mention as well is with regards to law and regulation, because standards need to work underneath the law. Law is a legal requirement. You have no option other than to follow that. Standards should be supporting that. And so there should be nothing ever written in a standard that would be against what the legal requirements are. And in fact, we should be writing standards with an eye on what those legal requirements are. Where this can be quite straightforward at US national level, where we have regulators like FDA as active participants, and they act as a bit of a steer to make us stay on the right side and in alignment with FDA guidance documents, for example, as well as the law. When we get to international level, that gets a little bit more complicated, because the world's not the same. We've got different legal requirements in different parts of the world, and that requires a very cautious approach, so that we're writing requirements in a standard that are supporting as best we can the bigger picture, rather than being too specific.
Yeah, and there's different equipment internationally. There's different devices. There's different water quality. I know the first time I attended the World Sterilization Congress, I was kind of blown away by how different the world of reprocessing is, even from country to country. So I can imagine the standards applications of that plays out as well. So Jill, let's switch gears here to practical advice around standard impacts and implementation into some of our workflows. And we'll start with endoscopy reprocessing. Obviously, hot topic with ST91 out there and other documents like that. Inside and outside of AMI, obviously recommendations at play. What are some best practices that you've been focusing on as an IP support person in the last 2 to 3 years?
I know everybody's heard me talk about borescopes probably enough the last couple of days here at the conference, but I'm going to talk about borescopes some more. We implemented borescoping slowly. I know a lot of people are still fighting to get borescopes in their endoscopy departments and in their SPDs, but that is one thing that we in my healthcare institution did. We bought them. We started implementing them slowly. And when I say slowly, it was not every scope every time. It was every 5, 10 scopes, because it does feel like a lot of work. It feels like it's going to slow you down. We had to really educate everybody, get everybody really good at borescoping to where they could do it efficiently. They could feel the impacts. They understood why it was important. And we eventually got to the point where now we're doing it every scope, every time. And you do have to also make sure that you have an SOP in place to say, okay, if you find something, what do you do? And then if you find something again, then what do? You don't want to just keep reprocessing it over and over and over. When do you send it out? So that's really important. And then what do you do for quality testing? And so now we're doing that as well. Some people are saying borescope or quality test. Are you doing a protein test? Are you doing a combination test? We're doing both. It's not an either or. They're doing two very separate things. So, we're doing both. And so again, we've kind of built up to that. So if somebody listening is saying, wow, we're not doing any of that yet, it's not something you have to do right away, but definitely start somewhere. And as IPs, we're constantly auditing. We're doing tracers, and we make our own tracers, and anybody can do this. You just take the IFUs for a specific type of scope, and we make our own tracers step by step, and we audit per that scope. Make sure every step is being done. And if it's not, then we try to figure out why. Are they not doing the manual cleaning correctly? Are they not doing the drying correctly? And that's how we continually improve in endoscopy. And yes, it's a lot of work, but at this point, we are so much better in our endoscopy department for it.
Right. What would you say the current state of standards in relation to borescopes is? Like, are we clear? Is it clear in every standard now that you should be borescoping, and how much and when and why? Is that an example of best practice that's kind of leading out in front of the standards? What's your pulse on that?
I mean, I definitely think it's an example of a best practice. I don't know when or how or if it's going to become a standard, because it does cost money. And a lot of places are financially not in the same spot as others. But you do start to see, like we showed in our presentation on Sunday, that some of the IFUs are saying inspect all components for corrosion, rust, damage. You can only inspect, quote, all components if you have a borescope to go inside these lumens. You can't do that with a magnifying glass. So if you don't have a borescope, you can't follow the IFUs. So I think we're going to start seeing more IFUs include that. Maybe not so much the standards. The standards maybe are going to start recommending it, but the IFUs are going to start requiring it. And so that's where it's going to get tricky, where the IFUs are going to start requiring more, and you're not going to be able to follow them if you don't have a borescope.
So Richard, Jill brought up another great question that I'd like to get your insight on, and it's the realistic and sometimes the financial ability for departments to implement a standard. And, that's a consideration point, obviously. If the consensus group says, hey, like, we could make a standard, but no one would be able to afford to follow the standard. And so we would be recommending 100% non-compliance across the country because no one's going to be able to do that. How do you balance the reality of the market, where we are, how long it's going to take us to get from status quo toward best practice, but maybe more baby steps? Like, what's that conversation like in those standards development meetings?
Okay, so in an ideal world, of course, we would never have to consider money. We only consider patient safety, and we do whatever is best to ensure that patient safety. We have to recognize, of course, financially that that's a burden that we all have. And so the correct answer, I think, is the fact that the people who are writing the standards, practitioners who are actually involved in the development of standards, are not going to write impossible requirements, not only to do with patient safety, but to do with finance as well. We're just talking about endoscopes a moment ago. The general feeling is that, endoscopes were always considered to be semi-critical devices and were typically high-level disinfected. But I think we all recognize as well that an endoscopy procedure is not just a semi-critical use. It could be a critical use as soon as we get into performing a biopsy. And so then, if we respect Spalding's classification, then endoscopes should be sterilized, whether it's liquid chemical sterilization or low temperature sterilization. I think that's something that we're moving towards. That has all manner of different connotations or implications for us as we move into that world. But is that the right thing to do? And I think we all understand, those of us that understand, the need to have sterile and appropriate instruments, that's the way that we're going to be moving. Are we doing that in one fell swoop? No, but we're moving in that direction. And I think it's appropriate that we move in that direction. But the cost of a high-level disinfection process versus a sterilization process is not really that significant. It's just something that we've got to reconsider as we go forward.
Right. Is there anything else besides that transition from HLD to sterilization? Obviously, that's one of the hot topics in endoscopy. So what other trends or other changes to standards are we seeing today in the endoscopy reprocessing space?
Well, I think storage of endoscopes is a huge area because, of course, if they're not dry and they're stored wet, they can be a focus for recontamination. So we might have decontaminated them, but they can then recontaminate. And that's one of the hidden benefits almost of if we can sterilize devices. And I know there's some compatibility issues with some processes and some equipment as well. But if we can actually sterilize them, we can have them packaged and as a terminal process. Therefore, they can be stored almost indefinitely until they're ready to be used, as opposed to trying to store them. So endoscope storage, I think, is a huge area that is in front of us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's another Wild West, I think, was the phrase we were using earlier this week in that space. Let's talk a little bit, Jill, about audits. You've mentioned a couple of different assessments, risk analysis, the tracers you mentioned. Obviously, audits have a strong part to play in not only implementing standards, but then also after you have implemented new standards, ensuring that your team and your workflow is doing what you have planned it to do. So how do you conceptualize your audits? How do you run your audits as an IP support to your sterile processing team? And what advice specifically around that topic would you give?
Yeah, so I think making sure that you're doing them at a frequency that is helpful. And I say that because some people can audit too frequently and some people can audit not enough. And I've heard everything on this spectrum, that IP doesn't even know how to find SPD or endoscopy. And then I hear that IPs hear too much and they're annoying. So there's everything on the spectrum here. But it's not just making sure that you go at the right frequency. It's also making sure that you give a report or feedback that's helpful, and that you don't just drop off the report and leave and never come back, but that we work together to come up with an action plan. So that's on us. That's on the IPs, but that's also on the people that run the department, and making sure that we're working together and that we have a good relationship ahead of time. And again, I've heard all sorts of different ideas of how that's supposed to go. I've heard some people say, I love my IP. We have such a great relationship. And I've also heard, I don't even know who that is. And how do I find them? So for anybody listening, if you don't know who the IP is, invite them down. Just call them, email them and say, do you want to come down and do rounds with me? Do you want a tour? Or let's set up monthly rounds, because if they already don't know how to find SPD or endoscopy, they may not just come on their own. IPs that don't already know SPD or endoscopy, they may not just come down and say, show me, I don't know, I need help. IPs sometimes don't feel comfortable doing that. So just invite them and help them learn. If an IP already knows, but they don't come frequently enough, then again, just invite them to come and say, let's set up monthly rounds so we can do it together. But that follow up is probably the part I think is missed the most. So they drop off their audits, they send it to you, but they're not working together to make sure that it's taken care of.
Yeah, that confidence piece, I don't think you used the word, confidence, but a lot of our IPs, there's this perception from sterile processing that IPs know about everything. They already know. They don't need to learn from me as a sterile processing professional, but that's just not the case. And if you get a lot of IPs in your office and you're honest with each other, like they need to know, they want to know more about SPD in order to help us, because they do have great resources, skill sets, frameworks, to help us do the audits, help us do the risk analysis. But then they still need to understand the basics of our workflow. And many, many, many times they're willing to learn from us as that sterile processing user in the facility. So that's a great call out. Richard, let's talk about data a little bit in the sterile processing space. Obviously, we've got a lot of technologies like inventory management systems and data capture these days that are giving us way more information than we've ever had about what's actually happening in our departments. What advice or what have you seen out there in a way that departments are using data to drive best practice, to implement these standards, documentations, or recommendation that are tying it all together and showing the results of now hardwiring these compliant processes in place?
So I think there's two areas that data is really important. One of them is in tracking. We need to know what we've done and where it is. So tracking is incredibly critical. So that level of data is really important to understand that we've done what we've done properly. But secondly, that data can give you an awful lot of information with regard to the process that's taking place. Remember that, of course, within an SPD, there are multiple processes which are often consecutive. And so you need to understand where your bottlenecks are. You need to understand, people often focus on how long a washer disinfector takes to complete its cycle. But if the washer disinfector isn't being loaded or isn't being emptied, that's also impacting on what you're doing. So all of that, by using data, that can give you a true picture of how you can get better efficiencies in your workflow by understanding where the bottlenecks are, and the bottlenecks may be us, the human beings, not necessarily the equipment.
Right. And, historically, at least like as an early sterile processing leader in my career, I didn't have the data that I wanted, and I was complaining, I need more data, I want more data. I don't think that's really the problem anymore, at least if you have one of these tracking systems or inventory management softwares. You have the data now, but now the challenge is I've got all this data. What do I do with it? And how do I now take this to confirm or validate my process? And then back to the standards, how do we scale this data across the industry so we really see where are the gaps, where are the challenges, if it's quality assurance data, quality management data that we're boroscoping? How do we take your individual boroscope data and then scale it up with everyone else across the U.S. that's now boroscoping their shaver handles or everything else, and then use that to inform how we're creating standards? I think it's a really exciting time in the world of data, to make smarter decisions like that. Let's talk, Jill, about how education impacts our sterile processing departments. We've talked a lot about standards and the shalls and the shoulds, but the shall and the must is we must educate. Whatever standard you're following, whatever you're seeking to implement, that implementation is a code word for education. Can you give me a story or two about how transformative you've seen education be in solving specific workflow challenges or non-compliance challenges in these departments?
Yeah, we had a very specific challenge a few years ago that we worked on that involved the entire hospital. And everybody's probably familiar with transportation issues of soiled instruments. And our particular issue spanned the entire hospital. So we're talking clinics, critical care, all of the procedure areas like IR, cath lab, women's health, and no one was transporting correctly. No one was spraying their instruments. We had the Rubbermaid containers. We had people transporting just in red bags. I mean, it was atrocious. And so we had to educate not just SPD, but all of those areas, which included nursing, who had no idea why they needed to learn how to spray instruments. And they had no idea why they needed to learn how to put things in a red bin. We also had to educate them on how to find SPD because they had no idea where SPD was, but they now needed to learn how to get their instruments there when they use them. And what we also learned was Joint Commission will ask the nursing units, even the ones that don't have the instruments, they'll also ask those units, what if you did have something that had instruments or soiled instruments? Where would you find the spray? Where would you find a red bin? So you now have to educate every single unit, every single department to make sure that they would know how to treat that. So education became very, very important. I had to partner very closely with my SPD director Some people have educators, some people don't. Sometimes they go on FMLA, sometimes they have a vacancy, you never know. So education became so important, and I had to do some of it. The director had to do some of it, but we were out there educating every single department, everybody in SPD, the OR, the women's health, everybody. We had to get all new equipment, all new products throughout everybody in all the clinics. And this was a huge undertaking. And we took compliance from before we started to after. And even though it took a lot of work, in the end, compliance shot up, and it was a huge success. But yes, it did take a lot of education, and we had to teach them the why, which I know we've talked a lot about with everything, but understanding the why we had to do this, which was harder for people outside of procedural areas to understand that why. I feel like it's even harder for the OR to understand sometimes, why am I spraying these instruments and doing your job, quote unquote, right? But telling nursing now that they've got to start cleaning the instruments, it was just another whole thing. So doing that education across the whole hospital, it was a big impact, but also high effort. But it definitely was a big success.
Many times we talk about this in episode 1 with Karen Owens and Yves Theodule, but the manner in which you do the education is almost just as important sometimes in the education you're providing, because it's earning back that buy-in, that trust, especially if you're talking about the clinic environments or if you're talking about endoscopy outside of your sterile processing center. If you do the education too flippantly or without enough planning and communication and follow-up, it's actually hurting your cause for education. So all that planning you mentioned, the collaboration, the work, the rollout, take your time. This is the advice for the educators listening out there. Take your time to do it right, because this is more important than just getting people to do it this new way. It's earning that, so the next time you do education, they're more responsive and they trust you that you've got a plan and you're going to follow up with that plan. And I know we talked about auditing afterwards, but do audits after you do education to make sure this thing is sticking, right? So Richard, let me come to you on a balance. I keep throwing you all these balance questions here. So the balance between the day-to-day sterile processing operations, many of us feel like that's all we can see. It's the fire in front of us today on Monday morning that we have to put out. And then Tuesday, there's like another fire. And yet there's still a need for long-term planning in our departments. The next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, what is this going to look like? What is our volume impact? What shifts are we seeing in our local market? Are we getting new service lines coming in? Are we building a new tower? How do we break out of just the day-to-day kind of tunnel vision and also make sure that we're going a particular direction and not just anywhere we end up?
Well, I can give you a personal example that what I have got out of standards development by participating with a group of my peers who probably lead similar lives to me, that can be invaluable because it gives you a completely different perspective on life. You're absolutely right that day to day you're very much focused on what's directly in front of you, but the ability to interact or interface with your peers who probably serve similar functions and have similar problems, then discussing those things collectively can often give you a different insight to what you should be doing. But I agree there needs to be a longer term strategic view on where we need to be going, how we increase capacity, how we increase technology, how we utilize technology to better serve what we're trying to achieve. Jill's presentation earlier this week talking about the horrific story, good presentation, but a horrific story of devices that couldn't be cleaned. And that sort of thing needs to be considered in our long-term strategy as well, not just about throughput, but how we're doing what we do better and more effectively so we don't have those nightmare scenarios that Jill was talking about.
And, the previous episode that talked about renovation and new construction, obviously anytime there's one of those events, that is the time to definitely be looking at this is going to impact our department for perhaps the next 20 or 30 years. Some of our departments, you get one shot, and if you get it wrong, you're going to have to live with this for many decades. And so, yes, those moments especially, but then to your point, every single day we should be reaching out of the four walls of our department and saying, what else is going on out there that's going to impact me and my team and my workflow in the next 4 or 5 years? And that's the standards that we've been talking about today. So I got one more question here before we move to a close, and it's actually tying in back to episode 1 around sustaining the change or sustaining the excellence that we've built in our departments. Many attendees here in Louisville at the HSPA conference, many people who are tuning into this podcast, they've done great work, Jill. They have implemented standards. They're trying to move step by step into best practice. And all the work that goes into that, all the passion, all the drive, it has to be sustained. Some of the most heartbreaking experiences you can have is go through the education, tell everyone, get your competencies updated, SOPs, and then 6 months later you realize we're still doing it the old way, or it's still a broken process, we're still not compliant. So we'll start with you first, Jill. What advice would you give to keep not only compliance with the changes, but keep that momentum and that passion and that buy-in day to day, week to week, month to month over time, so we're continuing to build on all those achievements?
I think this is one of the hardest things, no matter where you work or what industry you work in. This is the hardest part. Sustainment is so difficult, especially if you don't have a plan for sustainment. So anytime that you're doing any type of change, you have to plan ahead for that. How are you going to come back and see how things are going? And I think you also have to plan on failing or plan on things not going well and being able to pivot if things aren't going well and being able to do something differently. You can't automatically think we're going to do this and it's going to be perfect and everything is going to go just hunky-dory and we're going to be great. One thing that we have found that always works is a little bit of competition. And as silly as that might sound, we have done some things in my institution where we have trophies and people compete against each other in different things, and you get the trophy for a month, or you get this little prize, you get a Starbucks card if you are the best this month. And just the smallest recognition, the smallest kind of competitive trophy for the month or whatever, that really gets people going. And so if you can work in whatever change you've made, if you can work in like each month saying, Hank, you win X whatever this month, it not only draws attention to the fact that you changed something, it reminds people what they're supposed to be doing, but it also recognizes you, Hank, as doing something well, but it's like subliminal message reminds people what they're supposed to be doing too. So it's kind of a double thing. And I love doing these little mind tricks for things like that too, because everybody's focusing on the yay, Hank, you won, you did it. But really we're reminding people about that change we made and what they're supposed to be doing.
I love that because it's not a checkbox. It's not cold and sterile. It's personal. It's cool. It's new. It's fresh. I love that. Richard, we'll give you the last word here. What advice would you give on sustaining momentum in engagement with standards? If we see standards go in a particular direction, obviously that's a long haul. Like you said, it could be many years. What keeps you going, and what would you like to share to get other folks not only to come to one meeting, but come and stay over the course so they can see these changes happen?
Okay, so I agree with you that people are our greatest resource. People are critical to what we do, and we can't do it without those people. So keeping those people interested, excited, passionate is critical. Events like this one, HSPA, great for bringing people together, like-minded people. The standards development process that I'm very passionate about myself, where we work with our peers, that helps to bind people together as well. I am completely passionate about, what I do simply because of the network of friends and colleagues that I've built up over many, many years. And it's that keeps me interested. It keeps me focused. It keeps me passionate about what we do. So anything we can do slightly outside of the day to day to give people a slightly different dimension on what they're doing, to see, helicopter view of what we really do in life is critically important.
And that's a great call out, that it's the people that actually keep you engaged, right? Like, they're the ones that keep you coming back because you get to see their passion and their momentum and their excitement about it. And then that fuels yours. I think that's a great way to wrap a fantastic conversation today, Richard and Jill. Great insight again around compliance, but also in getting involved in the creation of these standards and the creative implementation of them at the ground level. Then the tie-in back to the data piece as you implement, using what you're learning and feeding it back into the standard creation process to ensure, hey, what we change in that standard is actually doing what we thought in the industry. If it's not, well, let's make sure in the new update that we're tweaking it again, but we've got to get that user feedback like we've said over the last hour. Great conversation today. I want to thank all of our great live audience who's hung with us here for the last hour, and everybody else tuning in after the fact. Really appreciate you tuning in here to learn about staying ahead of industry standards and best practice. Jill and Richard, thank you again. And like we close every episode of the Beyond Clean podcast, we want to remind you all out there to keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.